Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking the time this afternoon to reflect together. My name is Dustin Ragland. I live in Atlanta and work for Ableton to connect and support educational communities in the southeastern U.S. The paper I'm reading today is called Music and Meaning, Navigating Contemporary Music Education Through Philosophy. So consider a short and somewhat famous pair of pericopes in the world of philosophy, the first of which is, quote, "A sound is an object, followed by another, where all the sounds similar to the first are followed by sounds similar to the second. A sound is an object, followed by another, and whose music always conveys the thought to the other." End quote. And here's a second quote for you. "A musical work is sound, but what is sound? Sound is the impulse, but what is the impulse? The impulse is a relation that relates itself to itself, or is the relations relating itself to itself in the relation. The music is not the relation, but is the relations relating itself to itself. A musical work is a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of the temporal and the eternal, of freedom and necessity. In short, a synthesis. A synthesis is a relation between two. Considered in this way, a musical work is still not a sound. In the relation between two, the relation is the third as a negative unity, and the two relate to the relation and in the relation to the relation. Thus, under the qualification of the psychical, the relation between the psychical and the physical is a relation. If, however, the relation relates itself to itself, this relation is the positive third, and this is the musical work." End quote. Now, this second longer paragraph is my example adaptation of Soren Kierkegaard's opening in The Sickness Unto Death, an introduction that may or may not be a mockery of Hegel's own phenomenology of spirit. The first quote, however, is an adaptation from a small but significant thought in David Hume's An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. This was a creative adaptation by student Madison Denton, working from the prompt I gave to perform an adaptation, a portmanteau of adoption and adaptation, on an otherwise non-musically themed bit of reasoning. The students were to place some kind of musical term, even the broad work of the word music itself, into the text, but allow the grammar of the passage to persist. My hope was that for them not only to observe and use the flow of thought in each passage, but to also come to an understanding of what music not only is to them, but could mean for themselves and others. In this paper, I argue that students studying and creating contemporary popular music in both academic and professional contexts will benefit from recognizing the ways that philosophy informs the music they encounter, usually in a subtle manner, and how philosophy can enrich the music they analyze, enjoy, and create themselves. I want to provide this argument by means of looking through a bit of the processes I used in developing a course on this topic at the Academy of Contemporary Music at the University of Central Oklahoma from 2014 to 2019. I hope to examine both the successful and less helpful approaches I took and how the course evolved by the time I left the faculty there. So the course context. The course I created to house these methods of reflection was called Music and Meaning, or Music plus Meaning, with a strong emphasis on the plus sign between the two loaded terms being as ambiguous as possible. From the naming of the course itself, I hope for students to engage with Wittgenstein's encouragement to fellow philosophers to, quote, "Don't think, look," even at the kernels of meaning that could be embedded in small grammatical symbols like the plus sign. A majority of the students were in the course to fulfill the final semester or two of their Bachelor of Arts coursework and were needing 3-hour electives like this one. This meant that the average student was experienced as a music creator, producer, and or music business person in the course of their studies. A common misunderstanding for students coming into the course was that it was going to be a lyric analysis course of some kind, as the students also had songwriting courses that dealt in depth with lyrical writing. While we did perform some lyrical analysis, it was almost always in a broader methodology meant to be a generative act to understand some larger theme or movement in the history of philosophy or of a specific thinker vis-a-vis a lyrical artifact. Very few students had any prior philosophical studies prior to coming to the class, and this was the assumption that I began with either way, that every student had the raw materials to engage with musical art thoughtfully. In the first class, I encourage students to examine their own musical tastes. What music do they go to in times of trouble or joy? What is the first thing they tell folks who ask what style of music they make? What are their guilty pleasures and why did they find them guilty? All of these make up an intuition, a taste that operates at a prehensile level. I then encourage them that the act of reflecting back on this and coming to an understanding around why and how their taste exists is a process of developing aesthetics, a term new to most of the students beyond some cursory familiarity. Indeed, the student musicians had a level of authenticity that they would often, find absent in certain well-known philosophical investigators of music themselves, by understanding, at the least, the bodily sensations, the embodied phenomena that occur when one attempts to put sound to meaningful use. Louis Mencius calls this the body voice as technology, technique, and techne among communities in the global South. Merleau-Ponty reminds us of the phenomenological engagement through both mental and bodily intelligence. A clarification that was important throughout the coursework is that we set a goal to study philosophy as it intersected with music throughout the parallel paths of their histories and ideas, often intertwined. Our grounding was in popular music as the primary arrival point of our main themes, as well as the primary well from which we drew musical examples, though not exclusively. We hope to join Anthony Kwame Harrison's work to address dichotomies between, quote, serious and popular musics, alongside many others. The final hope for the course was to have students engage with their own contemporary musics in their own genres and scenes, and to remain not style agnostic, but style attentive as much as possible. Hani Fedurki reminds us that it isn't always what you hear on the surface, but what you hear trying to claw its way out. And this is what we hope to explore. So some examples of coursework. In the opening example of the grammatical adaptation of a philosophical passage, one can already see the surprising fruits in the flow of reasoning in Hume's quote. Ms. Denton's adaptation echoes Abu Nasr al-Farabi's approach to understanding rhythmic modality in medieval Islamic music in his Kitab Isa al-Ikaat. It is also reminiscent of Edmund Husserl's phenomenology of temporal events and Henri Bergson's insight via Bella Balache, the insight that melody is not just in the notes, but their audible relationship. This collision of insights can be quite useful to an array of musicians and producers searching for a process to unlock a melodic challenge or an arrangement or sequencing challenge. It is also powerful in understanding, for example, Ableton Live's session view, where there is a relationship between ongoing musical reference, like meter, tempo, timing of phrases and sounds in sequence, but the sequence itself of each present element in a clip is determined in a flow of intended, protended, and retained loops and one-shot sounds, as Husserl might have described it. These points of connections between disparate thinkers, Hume, Al-Farabi, Husserl, Balache, working in seemingly distant philosophical and aesthetic contexts, create an opportunity for students to develop an ear for philosophical reasoning, just as they work to develop an ear for vocal intonation, playing to a click track, or mixing electric guitars. This ear for reasoning can be helpful in situations where a producer might need to argue the path that a writer-performer should take with respect to a lead vocal melody, for example, offering a reason to approach a very specific set of musical events with intention, giving confidence to the performer in the musical choices they are making. It can also be helpful as a generative process for working with specific music technology tools. If a student is composing a drum part in a MIDI piano roll, they are typically given a blank field of relatively dense note values, often 1 to 2 bars of 16th notes or at least 16 sounds to place in them. To have a philosopher or two of rhythm can help break through a common first step in a production. Perhaps it's James DeWitt Yancey, better known as J Dilla, with a, quote, conscious cultivation of rhythmic friction for maximum musicality and maximum surprise, as Dev Charnas puts it. Maybe it's Abu Nasr al-Farabi reminding the composer to begin with an ika, a fundamental form, then by ornamentation, including subtraction and space, make it your own. So some of the movements that we considered and examples from them. In attempting to engage a wide swath of possible philosophical topics in our movements, I would start from a simple pattern of identifying some variegated examples in the popular music, with an eye to starting just anachronistically enough to be unfamiliar to the students. So this unfamiliarity, or time out of mind, as Dylan might put it, would be just enough to interrupt the students' attention with an example that sought to show them how none of these contemporary musical philosophical artifacts were sui generis. We engaged political music by noticing the not-so-subtle power of Pete Seeger leading a not always metaphorically hammer-wielding crowd in song with If I Had a Hammer. We also saw how Bruce Cockburn updated the context to Central America and United States imperialism in the 1980s with If I Had a Rocket Launcher. We examined possible through lines from Fela Kuti's Rascally Republic in the song Zombie to Kendrick Lamar's visions of Compton as a republic of sorts in All Right. We examine the imagined urban landscape of P.J. Harvey's Stories from the City, Stories from the Sea, and where artists as diverse as the Slits and TLC and Bikini Kill had to carve space from masculinized musical power centers, only to end up with Where the Girls Aren't, quote, in the ensuing emo scene of the 90s and 2000s, as Jessica Hopper describes. An important topic that only began to grow during the run of the class was the intersections between visual arts and sound arts. In most of the students' work, sound installations and ambient music were ancillary to the interest, but many worked to score short films and short video assignments in both academic and freelance settings. To develop skills in discerning and creating based on visual phenomena and or prompts as one might receive them from a director or commercial brief, we spent time in the Oklahoma City Museum of Art, where the students were given readings from Matt Sakakini, Adorno and Eisler, Amiri Baraka, and Daphne Aram that reflected on tensions between complements between visual and oral phenomena. The students then had to use actual works in the museum to complete their various project briefs and attempt to communicate in musical terms what their visual connection points signified. Another engaging resource in visually understanding music alongside philosophy were Gines Carreras' Philographics, which put quasi-abstract form around various specific philosophical ideas. These were excellent as a cousin of sorts of Brian Eno's Oblique Strategies to build up the students' familiarity with various terms in a visually engaging format. In a study of existentialism, we spent time with Nietzsche's notions of Dionysian and Apollonian musical approaches and examined how understanding different animating forces in music creation can not only be a key to working with other musicians, but can unlock techniques within a writing process. This insight into even the most basic and early motivations behind one's own actual musical creations was jarring for some students, bringing them into confrontation with their own assumptions about why they began writing songs or making beats in the first place. We looked at the existentialist heart of LCD Sound System's Losing My Edge, where James Murphy communicates the borderland of existential angst to becoming older and less hip in a scene that values hipness above all else. For example, his insistence that
the kids are coming up from behind.
End quote. We looked at how that led into existential notions of authenticity in Kanye West's The Life of Pablo, and even how the method of releasing one's music can become part of one's drive for authenticity. The study of illusion in modernist and romantic poetry was the closest the course got to an expectation of lyric analysis that several students brought with them. We spent time examining illusion within Shayla Lawson's There Will Be Tears from her collection titled I Think I'm Ready to See Frank Ocean. In this poem, Lawson manages to weave allusions to The Cure, Billy Ocean, The Ocean, Lionel Richie, Narcissus, and of course Frank Ocean himself. We compared it to T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock and how A Tribe Called Quest worked with allusion in Award Tour. Close readings of these three works as both lyrics in music and as standalone text gave the students approaches to writing allusion in their own lyrical works and to appreciate where they recognized it in their favorite lyrics. They also began to see how sampling itself is a form of oral illusion and how to begin to parse the power of oral illusion in the context of its controversial legal and evil ethical standing. Rather than debating sampling as mere encomium or appropriation, theft, laziness, students were able to engage with an idea closer to Akui More's sense of expanding the vocabulary with samples and manipulations of them. Samples can bring a sonic reference into a track that signifies some important image or theme in a way that is often far more subtle than lyric allusion. And of course, not every contemporary work of music has lyrics to perform this signifying work. We would listen to abstract cover songs like Bad Plus's version of Smells Like Teen Spirit, just to see how far one could stretch an identifiable or familiar musical source. We examine the importance of core samples that transmute into better-known songs with SWV's use of Michael Jackson's Human Nature in Right Here, the Human Nature remix, and Mariah Carey's use of Tom Tom Club's Genius of Love and Fantasy. We debated the originality of Diddy and Mace's I'll Be Missing You and its position somewhere between a cover and a sample, but making sure to note that Sting himself did this with Prokofiev in the song Russians before Puff Daddy did to him. As someone whose most in-depth philosophical studies revolve around language philosophy and the resulting aesthetics of Ludwig Wittgenstein, I look forward to the portion of the semester when we engage philosophy of language directly. We spent time interrogating the alphabet soup of gear chat and how knowledge of ever more arcane terms can be used to exclude on both class and experience levels, not to mention alienating collaborators. We spent a moment comparing variations on the text message, okay, 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 K. This was a way for the students to recognize that they already have the skills to understand language's power in their musical lives. As Nancy Murphy describes it, quote, language is not about the world, a reflection of reality, but is in the world. And its appropriateness, efficacy, truth, and the like are a matter of how it comports with the actual living of life. In Electronic Sounds as Lively and Differentiated Individuals, Tara Rogers argues that, quote, metaphors pertaining to sound mediate a host of analogies that give meaning to understandings of bodily forms and embodied relations. Histories of sound and audio technologies are inextricably entwined with histories of the body and classifications of bodies according to attributes, end quote. Later on in the same essay, she brings a challenge that I often present to electronic music contexts, that the description of a sine wave as a pure tone contains more than just a hint about the lack of harmonics above the fundamental. She explains, quote, notions of the sine wave as pure and lacking body were articulated to cultural valuations of whiteness and scientific objectivity, while timbral variation came to signify marked forms of material embodiment, for example, raced, gendered, classed, end quote. Note that what was important here is that the students weren't nonplussed by this assertion, but rather they recognized language games from their own context and left with the actionable insight from Wittgenstein in his lectures on aesthetics that, quote, what belongs to a language game is a whole culture, end quote. So futures here. A primary fallacy in my first semester and subsequently in the course was a highly male and Eurocentric collection of thinkers to engage with. Indeed, after one semester, I made every attempt to jettison the notion of a canon entirely of Western philosophy, while attempting to reckon with my own personal canon of familiarity and what I was trained in. This remains ongoing work for any scholar, myself included, and the most impactful input always came from me listening to my students' feedback on new and unfamiliar voices. We did include thinkers outside of European males from the beginning, like rhythmic and tonal approaches from Al-Farabi, insights from the Natya Sastra, Ishak al-Mosili, Sun Tzu, and Lu Qi. These expanded as time went on, and a strong focus came from including female and non-binary thinkers, whose absence in typical philosophical spaces, especially prior to the modern era, meant that we had an opportunity to remove the silo of expectations of what a philosopher of music needs to be. Philosophical insights came from theoreticians like Daphne Aram and Delia Derbyshire, but also from poets like Shayla Lawson, contemporary thinkers like Victoria Armstrong, Holly Herndon, Tara Rogers, Robin James. Today's contemporary popular music education has a host of issues to remain engaged with and thoughtful of. Alternative forms of musical economics intertwine with environmental concerns in music communities' engagements with Web3 technologies, for example, with thinkers like Sherry Hugh leading accessible entry points for consideration. Designing musical instruments that are creatively engaging while still being accessible, developed affordably, and created with sustainable materials and life cycles is an ever-shifting challenge that requires an eye to what's come before and why it came as it did, and what could be coming. Continued design of DAWs that are even more untethered to the prior era's technological analogies like tape machines, step sequencers, requires thoughtfulness and constant weighing of possibilities. Designing popular music creation tools that break free from Eurocentric assumptions is an ongoing research project of thinkers like Alice Tomás de Carvalho, John Silapaimanat, Ana Maria Ochoa Gutier, and Kaya Malami. All of these challenges become opportunities in the hands of musicians, music business people, producers, and all manner of musical professionals who have cultivated their reasoning to respond with creativity and care to the communities at work creating with sound in the current musical era. Susan McClary offers a fitting coda, quote, the historian of the future will no doubt yearn to have experienced what it was like to be alive at this very moment, trying to make sense of the bewildering profusion of musical practices and critical opinions. That's why it's so important for us to perform, if only from time to time, an anthropology of ourselves, for there's no time like the present, end quote. Thank you all so much for your time. Thank you for APME for having me. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.